What happens when a nation is at the height of glory, only to spiral into division and chaos? Can faithfulness to God change the course of a nation? In today's episode, we explore 1 Kings, a story of Solomon's wise reign, the building of the temple, and the tragic division of Israel. From the wealth and wisdom of Solomon to the battles of faith faced by the kings that followed, 1 Kings reveals the critical choices that shape the future. How can we apply these lessons to our own lives, leadership, and faith? Let's dive into the powerful journey of Israel's kings.
Welcome to our exploration of 1 Kings. It's a really wild ride, this book. It's got all the good stuff. Leadership drama.
Oh, yeah.
Epic showdowns.
Yeah.
And thought-provoking questions about faith.
You know what's so captivating about 1 Kings? It reads like a historical novel, full of these larger-than-life characters just wrestling with their destinies. But amidst all that political intrigue and personal struggle, it really explores God's influence in the lives of both individuals and nations.
Yeah, and I was really struck by the story of King Solomon. His reign began with such promise. God grants him anything he wants. And Solomon, instead of asking for wealth or power, chooses wisdom. Why do you think that choice was so significant?
Well, I think Solomon's request for wisdom reveals a really deep understanding of his role as king. He recognized that true leadership wasn't about personal gain.
Right.
It's about serving his people effectively. And the Bible tells us that God was pleased with his request, granting Solomon not only wisdom, but also riches and honor beyond measure.
And that wisdom really shined through, especially in those early years of his reign. We see him resolving disputes with incredible insight, expanding Israel's influence, and of course, building that magnificent temple in Jerusalem.
Oh, the temple.
Yes.
It became like a symbol of God's presence among his people,
Yeah.
a focal point for their worship, a testament to Solomon's devotion. It was a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity for Israel, truly a golden age.
But then
Things take a turn, don't they?
Yeah, sadly they do. Solomon's story is kind of a cautionary tale about how even the wisest individuals can stumble. Despite his initial commitment to God, he gradually allows himself to be influenced by, his foreign wives and their idolatrous practices.
It's almost as if he forgets the source of his wisdom and success. The very things that brought him to such heights, his relationship with God and his commitment to his people, and become overshadowed by his pursuit of personal pleasure and political alliances.
Exactly. Solomon's heart is divided.
And this division has some serious consequences, not only for his personal life, but for the entire kingdom. He builds altars to foreign gods, leading the people of Israel astray, and ultimately paving the way for the kingdom's division after his death.
It's a stark reminder that even the greatest leaders can fall to temptation. And those compromises, even the seemingly small ones, can have far-reaching consequences. How can we, as individuals, guard against making similar mistakes? What are the golden calves or the balls, that might be distracting us from what really matters?
It's a question worth pondering. I think Solomon's story highlights the importance of constantly seeking God's guidance, examining our motivations, and surrounding ourselves with people who will hold us accountable. We need to be, vigilant about identifying and rejecting anything that might lead us away from God's will, whether it's the pursuit of wealth, the desire for approval, or the temptation to compromise our values for the sake of convenience.
And this brings us to another key theme that emerges in 1 Kings, God's sovereignty. Even as human leaders make their choices, good or bad, we see God's plan continuing to unfold.
Absolutely. Take, for instance, the showdown between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. It's a powerful illustration of God's power and authority, a moment where the true God is revealed and it's undeniable.
Oh, I was on the edge of my seat reading that account. It's almost like a scene from an action movie. The tension just builds as Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal, and then boom, God sends fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, proving his power beyond any doubt.
And what's fascinating is that this event occurs during the reign of Ahab, one of the most wicked kings in Israel's history. Even amidst the idolatry and the moral decay, God remains active, raising up Elijah to challenge the status quo and call the people back to him.
So what does this tell us about God's role in our own lives? Even when things feel, chaotic or out of control.
Yeah. Well, I believe it offers a profound message of hope and reassurance. It reminds us that even when we make mistakes, even when we feel like we're surrounded by darkness, God is still at work.
Right.
He's faithful to his promises, and his plan will ultimately prevail.
It's a reminder that we're not alone in our struggles, and that even in the darkest of times, we can hold on to that certainty of God's presence
Yes.
and his unwavering love.
That's beautifully put. It's like a thread of gold woven through the tapestry of First Kings. A reminder that even when human choices lead to chaos and destruction, God's faithfulness remains constant, offering us a beacon of hope and the promise of redemption. As we delve deeper into First Kings, it becomes clear that the consequences of Solomon's choices really extend far beyond his own lifetime.
Oh, absolutely. The
Yeah.
seeds of division, sown during his reign eventually lead to like the whole kingdom splitting in two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south.
Precisely. And this division wasn't just political, it had profound religious implications. Jeroboam, the first king in the northern kingdom, fearing that his people would return to Jerusalem for worship, establishes these alternative religious centers. And he sets up golden calves as objects of worship.
Oh, wow. So the cycle of idolatry that began under Solomon, it like continues to plague the divided kingdom. It's as if they've forgotten the lessons of the past and are just, repeating the same mistakes that led to their downfall.
Yeah. And this is where the role of the prophets becomes even more crucial. Figures like Elijah and Elisha, they emerge as God's spokesmen, fearlessly challenging the kings and the people to turn back to the one true God.
I'm particularly drawn to Elijah's story. He stands up to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, two of the most powerful and ruthless figures in Israel's history, and just denounces their idolatry. Talk about courage. What can we learn from his unwavering faith in the face of such opposition?
Well, Elijah's life is a testament to the power of obedience, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He understood that his allegiance was first and foremost to God, not to any earthly ruler. Right.
He reminds us that true faith isn't passive. It requires action, even when it comes at a personal cost.
And his story is full of these incredible moments where God's power is on full display. The contest on Mount Carmel, the drought that he calls down upon the land.
Oh, yeah.
And even his miraculous ascension into heaven in a whirlwind.
Those events really serve as powerful reminders that God is actively involved in human affairs, that he holds ultimate authority, and that he's always working to draw his people back to himself.
But it wasn't always easy for Elijah. He faced moments of doubt, discouragement, even fear.
Oh, absolutely.
At one point, he flees into the wilderness, feeling totally alone, defeated.
That's right, yeah. Even the greatest prophets experience human weakness. But God meets Elijah in his despair.
Yes.
Reminding him that he's not alone and renewing his strength for the tasks ahead.
It's a reminder that God's grace is sufficient for us, even in our weakest moments.
Yeah.
And that he can use our struggles, to refine our faith and equip us for greater service. Exactly. And just as Elijah mentored Elisha, passing on that mantle of prophetic leadership, we too are called to support and encourage one another in our faith journeys, reminding each other of God's faithfulness and the hope we have in him.
So we've talked about the divided kingdom, the role of the prophets, the ongoing struggle with idolatry. But what about the theme of worship? Earlier we discussed Solomon's temple as a symbol of God's presence among his people. How does that translate to our lives today? Do we need to build physical temples to experience God's presence?
That's a great question. While the temple played a central role in ancient Israel's worship, I believe the deeper meaning goes beyond, physical structures. The temple was meant to be a place where heaven and earth met, where God's presence dwelled in a very special way. It was a reminder that God desired to be in relationship with his people.
So it's more about creating a space in our lives, both physically and spiritually, where we can connect with God intentionally.
Exactly. It might be a quiet corner in our home, a walk in nature, or simply a few moments set aside each day to, pray and meditate on God's word. The key is to cultivate an awareness of God's presence throughout our day, seeking his guidance in our decisions, and living in a way that honors him.
It's about making that conscious effort to prioritize our relationship with God, to invite him into every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely. And the beautiful thing is that God's presence isn't limited to any specific location or time.
Right.
Through Jesus, we have access to him anytime, anywhere. We become living temples, carrying his presence within us wherever we go.
That's such an encouraging thought. But let's be honest, even when we know we should prioritize worship, it's so easy to get distracted by the busyness of life.
Oh, yeah.
How can we make worship a more integral part of our daily routine, rather than just something we do on Sundays?
It's a constant challenge, isn't it? But I think the key is to remember that worship isn't just about what we do. It's about who we are.
It's about having a heart that's surrendered to God, a life that's lived in obedience to His will.
Exactly. And when we truly worship God, it transforms every aspect of our lives, our relationships, our work, our decisions, everything is touched by His presence.
So it's not just about checking off a box on our to-do list.
Right.
It's about living in a way that honors God in every moment, allowing His love and grace to flow through us into the world.
Precisely. And that's the kind of worship that truly pleases Him, a heart that's aligned with His will, a life that reflects His glory.
This brings us to another important theme that runs through 1 Kings, judgment. It seems like every time a king turns away from God, there are consequences, both for himself and for the nation.
That's true. And it's important to remember that God's judgment isn't about punishment. It's about correction.
Right.
It's about turning His people back to Him, helping them see the error of their ways and experience the fullness of life that He desires for them.
So it's like a loving parent disciplining a child.
Yes.
Not out of anger, but out of a desire to guide them towards what's best for them.
Exactly. God wants what's best for His people. And sometimes that means allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices so that they might learn from their mistakes and return to Him with a repentant heart.
But it's not just about individual judgment, is it? We also see the kingdom as a whole suffering because of the leader's decisions.
That's right. The division of the kingdom is a stark reminder that sin has ripple effects. It not only affects our own lives, but it can also impact, entire communities and even future generations.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? It makes me think about the responsibility we have as individuals to live in a way that honors God and contributes to the well-being of those around us.
Absolutely. Our choices matter, and they have the power to shape the world around us, for better or for worse.
This reminds me of the recurring cycle we see in 1 Kings. Kings rise and fall. Some are faithful to God, others embrace idolatry, and the nation experiences periods of blessing and judgment.
Yay!
All seems so human.
It is. And that's what makes 1 Kings so relatable, even thousands of years later. It's a story about real people with real flaws and struggles, trying to navigate life and leadership in a world where both faith and temptation are ever present.
We see their triumphs and their failures, their moments of wisdom and their lapses in judgment.
Yes.
And I think it's in those very human moments that we find some of the most profound lessons about God's character and His interaction with humanity. It strikes me that the book of 1 Kings isn't just like a collection of stories. It's more like a tapestry, woven with all these threads of wisdom and idolatry and worship and judgment, and ultimately God's just unwavering faithfulness.
Yeah, it's a beautifully complex narrative, and it reveals so much about us, about human nature, about our relationship with God and the consequences of our choices.
We've encountered kings who sought wisdom and kings who totally succumbed to temptation. We've seen the just devastating effects of idolatry and then like the transformative power of repentance. We've witnessed God's judgment and His incredible mercy.
And through it all, we've seen how God remains faithful to His promises, even when His people stray from His path. He raises up prophets to speak truth to power. He provides guidance and direction in times of, uncertainty, and He offers forgiveness and restoration to those who turn back to Him.
So we've explored the major themes, the key characters, the timeless lessons of 1 Kings. But what's the one thing you hope our listener walks away with from this journey?
That's a great question. I think for me, the overall message of 1 Kings is this: God is sovereign. He's in control, even when things seem, chaotic and unpredictable.
Yeah, it's like that verse in Proverbs
that
says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." We can make our plans, but ultimately it's God who directs our path.
Exactly. And that's both comforting and challenging, isn't it? Comforting because it reminds us that we're not alone in this, but challenging because it requires us to surrender our own will to His.
It's about trusting that God has a plan, even when we can't see it.
And that His plan is always for our good, even when it doesn't feel like it. Sometimes the consequences of our choices, or even the choices of others, can lead us through some difficult seasons.
Right.
But even in those moments, we can hold on to the truth that God is working all things together for the good of those who love Him.
So if we were to sum up like all of 1 Kings in a few words, it would be trust God, seek His wisdom, live in obedience, and remember that His faithfulness never fails.
Couldn't said it better myself.
And one last thought for our listeners, something to ponder as you go about your day. If you were writing your own book of Kings about your life, what would the story be? What choices are you making today that will shape your legacy? What kind of leader, what kind of person do you want to be remembered as? Because just like the kings and queens of First Kings, our lives are being written page by page, choice by choice, and ultimately it's up to us to decide what kind of story we'll leave behind.
First Kings begins with the wisdom of Solomon, a king known for seeking God's guidance above all else. But how often do we turn to our own understanding instead of seeking God's wisdom in our decisions? Reflect on areas in your life where you need divine insight. Are you relying on God's wisdom or leaning on your own understanding? Wisdom starts with fearing the Lord and seeking His direction. If you want more of God's wisdom, subscribe, like, and comment. Where do you need God's guidance today? The building of the temple in 1 Kings shows us that God desires a place where His presence can dwell among His people. How often do we make room for God in our daily lives? Reflect on how you're creating space for God in your routine. Are you prioritizing time with Him, or are other things taking precedence? God longs for intimacy with us. If you're ready to make room for His presence, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you prioritize God in your life today? Solomon's prayer for wisdom in 1 Kings 3 teaches us the value of humility and asking God for help. But how often do we try to do things on our own, not acknowledging our need for God's guidance? Reflect on your approach to life's challenges. Are you asking God for wisdom, or trying to figure it out yourself? Humility opens the door for God to work in our lives. If you're ready to ask God for wisdom, subscribe, like, and comment. What area of your life do you need God's wisdom in today? 1 Kings shows us how Solomon's heart turned away from God as he allowed foreign influences and idols into his life. How often do we let distractions or sinful influences pull us away from God? Reflect on the things in your life that may be leading you away from God's best. Are you willing to remove those idols and turn back to God? If you're ready to remove distractions and refocus on God, subscribe, like, and comment. What idols are you willing to surrender today? The division of Israel in 1 Kings reminds us that disobedience and unfaithfulness bring division. Reflect on your relationships. Are there areas where disobedience or bitterness has caused separation? God calls us to be peacemakers and to live in unity with one another. Are you pursuing peace or contributing to division? If you're ready to restore relationships, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you bring unity to your relationships today? 1 Kings teaches us about the power of obedience and the consequences of disobedience through the reign of King Ahab and his idolatry. How often do we allow sin and disobedience to creep into our lives? Reflect on areas where you're walking away from God's commands. Are you ready to return to obedience and align your life with His Word? If you're ready to live in full obedience, subscribe, like, and comment. Where in your life do you need to return to God's commands today? The story of Elijah in 1 Kings reminds us that God works powerfully, even in the midst of overwhelming opposition. How often do we shrink back from standing up for God because of fear or discouragement? Reflect on the battles you're facing today. Are you standing firm in your faith, or are you afraid to take a stand for what's right? Remember, God is with you in every battle. If you're ready to stand firm in your faith, subscribe, like, and comment. What battle are you facing that you're trusting God to help you win? 1 Kings ends with the rise of a new king, and we are reminded that God's purposes will always prevail. Reflect on the areas in your life where you've seen God's faithfulness and sovereignty at work. Are you trusting that His plan is better than your own, even when you don't understand the path? If you're ready to trust God's sovereign plan for your life, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you surrender your plans to God today? Share this message with someone who needs to trust God's sovereignty in their own life.